Welcome back. It's been a minute since we've checked in on the homestead, but we've got a little bit of progress and a bit more to talk about in terms of planning. So let's get into that over some time lapse of the work we have been able to do. To give some context to the background here, I'm working on digging from the recently installed utility meter box and disconnects over to the panel inside the barn. Unfortunately, due to a lack of supply, I had to pay an electrician to install that meter box for me, but we'll see that side of the building later in the video. On the upside, I found an electrician that was quite responsive, did quality work, and was perfectly reasonable on price, not to mention understanding that I wanted to do most of this work myself. Needle in that proverbial haystack of contractors, at least from what we've experienced thus far. In any case, I need to run the feeders from the disconnect to the panel, and since I want to use individual copper conductors instead of aluminum service cable, I'm trenching for conduit and figured I'd start by trying to get in a little workout too. And eventually I hit the spots where I used leftover concrete to raise the elevation at the front of the barn, so I end up pulling out the big guns to break that up. Now, if you've been following along with this build, you may be wondering why it took 3 months to get a new video up of just a trench. Well, the problem goes back to some of the red tape I mentioned in an earlier video. But as a quick recap, this lot was reclassified to wetlands somewhere back around 2011. No notice about the change, but we've had to pay to have that reevaluated again. And we thought that was behind us. However, when things move at the speed of government, the official maps haven't been updated yet. So now we're at the point of needing a septic design before we can get a building permit. And to get the septic design, we require a new elevation survey. But surveyors won't even give us the time of day when they feel like they're wasting their time on a wetland tagged lot because those can't be built on anyway. Explanation after explanation ensues, and we've just been going in circles. Well, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, we finally got a new map and a surveyor who responded with a willingness to help. But they wanted to charge nearly 5x what was quoted the first time we spoke to them just because they could, and said, well, inflation. Yep. So we're likely to see about a 500% increase from quote just because they can. All right, well, if there's nothing we can do without a surveyor, we're going to have to pay it. But at least it's progress. And we brought that update to our septic design team, who informed us that they're about 6 weeks out on design work, and that sort of sucks, but it's way better than hearing that the price went up 5x. Bottom line, we expect our septic design in early to mid-August, and contrary to the contractors, somehow the health and building departments around here tend to be responsive within literal minutes. Who'd have thunk the government would be the smallest obstacle here? So, checking in on that trench, I'm targeting a 24-inch depth to the bottom. And I'm just about there. A little bit of manual cleanup on the bottom, and I'll be ready to put the pipe in. And for the pipe, I'm using 1.5-inch PVC conduit, which will have a number 3 copper running through it. And that means I'm using a 100 amp rated wire on a 100 amp rated disconnect without any exceptions being needed. And if for some unlikely reason I want to upsize the panel in the future, I can pull all the way up to a 1/0 copper line without exceeding fill tables and go to a 150 amp panel, which will be more than enough for a one-man workshop if ever needed. Now you might also notice at the far corner that I have an orange plastic cap marking the other line coming from a 200 amp disconnect. This will eventually head towards the house, and that's going to be running in a 2.5-inch PVC. Again, I'm planning to use copper, in which case 2.5 inches is overkill, but if I end up having to use aluminum for any reason, I'm covered for 4/0 and even up to 250 kc mil if warranted. Once I get the pipe in, the angles work out on the far side that I need to heat and bend a little bit of the pipe, but from there it's a simple cut and deburr and then glue and go operation. And now before we set up to pull the feeder wires, I'm going to end up wanting to eliminate the safety hazard of having an open trench, and I'm going to backfill and lightly compact that. Definitely nervous about getting that close to a brand new barn with the excavator, but it turned out to be a non-issue, and the weight of that thing offers decent initial compaction. So what comes next for the rest of this year, and how does that shake out for the build? Well, on the assumption that our building permit is issued in the first half of September, we intend to begin the foundation. We're going to be sticking with the ICF construction and trying to get the footings and first 4 rows installed and poured. And at that point, we're at the mercy of the seasons again. Last year I was building the barn well into December, and this year is anybody's guess. I'm hoping this year, though, that between improved supply chain and learnings from last year's workflow, that I'll have the opportunity to make up for some of the time we lost on the already discussed red tape. The biggest difference is that I'm not between jobs this year, so any time I have will be much more limited and I'll need to make the most of it. Pulling the feeder wires turned out to be one of those tasks that I was happy to have Alila around for. We first tried to push a 14 gauge wire through to use as a fish tape, but it was a little too flimsy to be pushed the whole way through 48 feet in such a large pipe. It just wanted to keep folding over itself. So we switched to plan B, fired up the generator and tied a string to a shopping bag to suck through with a vacuum. I really wish I had been able to capture Alila's incredulous look when I suggested it, and also her flabbergasted reaction when it worked so flawlessly. We then traded the string for the 14 gauge wire, knowing that that could handle a lot more pulling force, and then set up to pull the feeders. Now, I gave her the choice of pulling or of feeding, and it surprised me a little bit when she wanted to pull. Now, neither of us have ever done this size wire, so I had no idea what to expect. And sure enough, the friction forces added up along the way, and we traded places. Once we got to the other end, we made the turn to get inside the barn, followed by the turn to get up into the panel. And from here, this is back to the usual stuff of leaving service loops and torquing down some screws. So there she is, all wired up for service. Now I just gotta call for an inspection. And call for inspection I did. We were green tagged and ready for our service to be connected. What I didn't expect is that the power company would actually tell me when they planned on being out. My expectation was that they sort of just show up sometime in a 10-day window and I would have a meter. Luckily, I was able to capture a little bit of what these elusive creatures do with their day. And it's nice to know these sort of things are covered in those taxes and fees that are on your bill. There was no extra charge for this hookup, though I'm guessing if we had chosen to put the meter on the house, we would have been near the limit of the included free wire length. The other thing they did is clear the trees around the overhead lines near the road. While I'm sure this would have been completed in normal course, it's a relief to know that summer storms and winter snow won't leave us at an increased risk of overhead lines failing. Now, before I leave you with closing thoughts from the day of the install, if you're finding any enjoyment in these videos, hit that like or subscribe button down below. And feel free to leave me a comment. It's actually the engagement with all of you that keeps me wanting to make these videos, regardless of if I ever get to monetize them. All right, so now the power company has come and gone. We've got our line run from our pad mount transformer, and that runs down along what will become the finished driveway eventually, and up into the side of the barn. It's a 320 amp service that we had put in, so that will eventually split from the meter to a 200 amp disconnect. That goes down and under and will eventually go to the house. And then that continues on through a 100 amp disconnect, which goes down, under, and right across here to the barn, which we saw in an earlier part of this actual video. But the reason I didn't end up going straight down and into the barn is because of the way that this project developed, and the panel is on the far side. I didn't want to run a bunch of exposed wire on the inside of the building, even though it is protected with a disconnect. But now we are 100% powered up, lights are on, and able to make some progress. Along the way, we also got our certificate of occupancy for this building permit, which means we were able to completely close it out. And eventually we'll go back through and we will insulate, drywall, and finish the inside. But because this is intended to be storage and shop space for the house build, there's no sense in damaging that nice finish and doing all that extra work now and using those resources for something that we could divert over to the house build. So stay tuned for that as it develops. Right now we are finalizing some of our red tape hurdles that we've been trying to get over and getting our septic design and site plan finished and building permit issued for the house. But that appears to be wrapping up in the next couple of weeks here. So we are going to start doing some real construction soon.